Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Centre for Digital Inquiry, based at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. For those of you who are new to the centre and its events, please check us out. You can follow one of the many links online, have a look at our website and our upcoming events. Today's talk is all about payments, specifically about the recently published book, New Money, How Payment Became Social Media by Lana Schwartz. I'm joined by Lana today, as well as Rachel O'Dwyer. Lana is an assistant professor at the University of Virginia in the Department of Media Studies. Her books involve Paid, a very, very interesting edited collection, as well as New Money, which we will, of course, be discussing today. And she has written many articles around the topic of money, digital money, payment, Bitcoin, and other kind of more fringe money stuff that's happening. She's very much becoming a major public commentator in this space. So we are very excited to have you, Lana. Hello.
Hello. And I should say that Paid, the edited collection, has an excellent piece by Rachel.
It's true. It's true. So, Rachel O'Dwyer, according to Google, Rachel, I'm not sure if you know this, but you are an Irish economist, which it's how I think about you. So
I saw that too. I thought that was quite funny the other day because it's getting reproduced now. It's one of those
in writing this current piece, someone cited you as they were like economists have analyzed, and it was so and so and O'Dwyer.
Yeah, it's obviously some machine learning, thing where it's obviously because it's money or something like that. Now now like my own institution put it in a biography the other day, and I was like, I don't know anything about house prices in Ireland and why they're failing, so I'm not really an economist at all. Yeah. Anyway.
Okay, so I'll give you an alternative introduction, not from Google, based on my deep understanding of reading your web profile, but So Rachel is a lecturer in digital cultures at the National College of Art and Design in Dublin, which is part of the University College Dublin. Her research sits at the intersection of digital culture and cultural economies, and she has authored many articles in this area on topics such as credit scores, scarcity, ether, transactions, blockchains, and so on. Rachel is also involved in many, I would say, kind of artistic practices and scenes, including things like Neural Magazine, but a number of other things as well. And I believe, although maybe I shouldn't be bringing this up, but you're working on a monograph. I know we've spoken about it in the past. I'll put that on the shelf. You can say yay or nay.
Yay. I finished it. Yeah, I finished it earlier in the year.
Oh, well, congratulations. So I've known Lana and Rachel, I guess, for near on a decade. I believe I invited both of you to the first ever Money Lab conference, and then edited early work by the two of you in the early Money Lab reader. And we have both kind of woven our ways in that scene now and then over the last decade. I'm somewhat more involved, but I've been enthusiastically kind of trying to get the two of you in when appropriate. For the people who are with us today, please put your questions in the Q&A, and we will attempt to answer them as we go or towards the end. Please note you won't be visible unless for some reason we decide to invite you into the panel, and then you will be visible. So just note that in terms of privacy, and also note that although your questions won't be visible, if we read them out and they contain personal information, then that information will be visible, and we take it as your approval if you write the question into the question and we answer it, that we're allowed to read it out. So without further ado, I hand over to Rachel. We'll keep this fairly open, and so go for it.
Yeah, so I I've just been so excited to have this conversation since Nate invited me. Because I really just, I love talking to Nate and Lana. I was actually interviewing Finn Brunton in another academic work on digital cash a couple of weeks ago, and he used a Mozart Salieri analogy between himself and Lana, where he was Salieri, and I was like, I completely understand where you're coming from, Finn. I just always learn a lot from these kinds of conversations. But I kind of wanted to kick off just with actually a question just more about your background rather than your book, because I'm not sure if I've ever asked you this, but you're someone whose work is at this very particular intersection between media studies and money studies. But I think I read somewhere that your background is your MA was in maybe fashion merchandising, or was it? Or am I completely wrong? Yeah, close, sorry, I meant to double check. It's something, but something that's not very money related. I feel like it was about Vablen goods and handbags or something. So I wanted to hear, I guess, how did you become so interested in money?
Yeah, so I did my master's in comparative media studies at MIT and finished in 2009. So it's been slightly less than a decade since we all met. We're not that old yet. So finished in 2009. And at the time, a lot of the conversations around MIT and around Berkman Center at Harvard and just in general were, and this is, conversations you both are very much immersed in, had to do with questions of intellectual property and creative, thinking about free software, thinking about free culture, Creative Commons, that sort of thing. And I came to the program quite interested in those questions. But I kind of began to feel, and this might be a kind of a recurring theme in my work and yours as well, Rachel, that some of these conversations were a bit of a boys' club, very focused on software, very focused on technology, and less their conversations around culture were quite clunky. I think we all have made the joke a million times about Creative Commons music and that sort of thing, or art projects that are about Creative Commons, but no one wants to use them for anything else. And I became, it's a little bit mean, but I became really interested in violations of intellectual property, so to speak, in practice. And I became completely obsessed with counterfeit luxury goods. So sort of fake handbags, and fake everything, and kind of regimes of ownership and authorship as it relates to fashion. So where is the meaning made? Is the meaning inhered in the logo? Is the meaning inhered in the assemblage of the outfit? How does this kind of operate? And then also, there were many artistic kind of movement practices around that time, like hand knitting a fake, Chanel bag, that sort of thing. And this is also early days of MySpace and Facebook. So, people using logos on their MySpace page in very flashy ways. So I got really interested in the history of intellectual property in fashion, the history of branding in fashion, and then the kind of practices around unauthorized use and unauthorized ownership. And I became really immersed in an online community, then a PHPB message board of people who were trying to buy and sell counterfeit luxury goods, and had the beginnings of really interesting global informal supply chains. So from there, I was sort of I kind of shifted away from intellectual property a bit and Creative Commons and that sort of thing, and began to think about kind of marketplaces as a culture and cultures of marketplaces. And then I began asking questions like, how are these people paying for these things? How are they doing these kinds of cross-border payments? Then, right when I started my PhD program, which would have been around 2009, 2010, was kind of the unfolding or the real denouement of the global financial crisis. And so suddenly money, I kind of had money and payments and marketplaces and rethinking. For me, it was all brand new. So I was money, kind of discovering the fact that economic anthropology existed as a field and economic sociology existed as a field at the same time that the whole world seemed to suddenly be rethinking money. So, the emergence of Bitcoin was 2008, 2009-ish, depending on where you count it. Lots of interesting projects around what started off as a sharing economy, lots of activism that, before and during and after Occupy. So I was really poised to think about these things right when everything sort of exploded. And then fortunately, I did my PhD in communication at the University of Southern California, but someone who's on my master's committee, an anthropologist who studies like artisanal practices. Actually, she studies like cheese, like is cheese science, craft, or art. And she told me that she knows Bill Maurer, who is at UC Irvine. So I got in touch with Bill, and he, we really crystallized. I mean, or he really helped me crystallize like thinking about payment in this way. And then because I was in a communication program, I was able to kind of bring something, I think, Bill comes at it from a very anthropological perspective. And so I was able to really zero in and say like, okay, infrastructure, like what does communication have to say about this? And how can I actually like take advantage of my training rather than being like a fake economic anthropologist? How can I, instead of trying to be something I'm not, how do I be what I am, or the kind of training that I'm actually getting, and bring that lens of asking questions about media, about information, about infrastructure, about communication to the work that Bill was, already doing. So yeah, that's how we got there.
I think that is so interesting. I actually never knew that's a backstory, but I think I had a very similar experience the first time I heard Bill speak, where I'd been kind of thinking about ownership of infrastructure and communications infrastructure, and then suddenly to hear him speak about how these sorts of infrastructures are really significant in money. And this is something that you're really exploring in your new book, New Money. So it's really, really rich, really kind of interesting sort of history that you offer of the, these interrelationships between money and communication, which, I think a lot of people probably aren't familiar with. And I was hoping that maybe, just because not everyone who's listening may be familiar with the book, that you might just even give us a little potted sort of a summary of what some of these historical connections. And then maybe from there, we could even talk a little bit about this idea of how the kind of material infrastructures of money matter and really, really matter today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And before I'm happy, I love talking about the history stuff, but I just want to also signal that I think it's really interesting that I know the three of us had all been kind of really thinking about free software, free culture, that sort of thing for a while, and like peer production. And then we got into money. And then it seemed that when all the kind of blockchain stuff happened, like peer production kind of came back around to us. So there's an interesting kind of zigzagging that sort of happened with the three of us and our interests and the world and then the field. So historically, I argue in the book that money can be understood as a form of media or a form of and I just want to say also, I know Rachel's not an economist, but neither am I. But I sometimes when people say, oh, you're arguing that money is a form of media, but it's a lot of other things too, isn't it? And I want to say that, my analysis is meant to be complementary or additive. It's not meant to say that money is only media and we should only think about it this way, which is sometimes, I think, misunderstood when I chat with people about it. But I think that so often when we talk about the politics of money, or talk about the way money is meaningful and has power in the world, the questions that get put forward are always economic, like questions of who has money, who doesn't have enough, who has too much, how it gets distributed through society. These are extremely important questions, and I'm not intending at all to shift away from those questions. But there are also questions that are, politics, that are communicative, informational, and relate to these kind of questions of infrastructure. So this is kind of like your second part of your question. Mm-hmm. And not being able to access the money that you have because of some feature of the technological system, not being able to move that money around or receive that money is essentially as good as not having any money at all, right? If you are cut off from accessing your money, then you might as well not have it, at least for a set period of time. And so I think that there are many questions that are sort of like communication politics, like questions of access, questions of flow, questions of controlling infrastructures that, now are becoming much more common as more people use kind of digital money systems. But I think at the time, and for a long time, have largely gone unexplored. So I think thinking about how money is, there's funny comments being made. Thinking about how money, oh, that's funny about that Bitcoin. I have anyway. Yeah. So really, if we bring the lens of like communication politics to money, it opens up a whole new set of questions for how it's important and how it could be kind of meaningful or like a form of counterpower. And so I sort of that is really what I then I set up that framing in the book and then attempt to seek to explore it, especially as it is a media and communication infrastructure that is very much in flux and like rapidly changing right now, both in terms of like experiments like Bitcoin, but also in everyday life, with new social media payment rails, especially in the US. But historically, to think about money as media, historically, every step of the way, the technologies and media forms that we call money, or we use to do money with, map alongside the technologies of communication and media more specifically. So just to kind of think about the modern era, we could go back to questions of like number and clay tablets and receipts and tally sticks. But just to think about the modern era, print currency is like quite clearly a form of media. It's covered with iconography of the nation state. It emerges at the same time that other forms of like print capitalism, to kind of go to like a Benedict Anderson argument, emerge. And it does many of the same things print culture and print capitalism do more broadly. So sort of inhere the nation state as like a economic territory, or as Eric Hellener puts it, creates a common economic language for members of the nation state to kind of communicate and speak with. It's covered with iconography of the nation state to kind of tell a shared past, to project into a shared future, to create this community of shared fate. And so when I talk to students about money as media, it's like, oh yeah, obviously this bill is quite clearly media. It's literally a print media form. But then as the kind of obvious kind of indexical or symbolic features fall away, we begin to it becomes a bit less obvious how we can think about money as media. Nevertheless, if we think then, and this is actually, I think, the subject of the first talk I gave when I met you, when you did your conference in Ireland, I think that was the first time we met. So many of today's consumer financial service companies, such as American Express and Wells Fargo, started off life as postal shipping companies, sort of competing with the United States Federal Post to deliver, by Pony Express, mail and banknotes and gold across and back and forth across the kind of expanding American colonial frontier. And it's interesting. There are, the U.S. service, the federal service was very, very, very concerned with questions of universal service and was very slowly building their postal routes to kind of serve everybody, but they served everybody very slowly and somewhat inefficiently. Whereas the Pony Expresses, the private expresses, were much more concerned, we're much more market driven, and therefore we're able to go to certain places, but much more quickly, but had no concern for creating a kind of universal service or providing any kind of common carriage. And we're thought to be cartels and price gougers and all this stuff. So then American Express, both the Federal Service and American Express began issuing money orders, essentially postal money orders, American Express money orders. And then as the Postal Service began to be, the private expresses began to be more regulated, as the Federal Service became stronger. And then with the outbreak of World War I, and when the Postal Service was like kind of fully nationalized temporarily, American Express said, fine, we're not doing postal anymore. And they had by that point moved completely into the money order business, and had built up a pretty sophisticated system of international correspondent banks, mostly used by immigrants. So the correspondent bank relationships were largely centered in Italy and Ireland at that time, because that is the kind of routes of remittance of in the US in that era. And actually they were able to raise a lot of capital, because a lot of the money orders that were sent to Europe went uncashed for some good amount of time, because the corresponding banks weren't actually there yet. So the float was actually quite high because of this kind of exploitation of, immigrant remittance networks. So anyway, many stories there that very much tie to kind of questions of identity, questions of the public and private, questions of service, all of which I argue are communication questions.
Yeah.
Then, kind of fast forwarding to the mid 20th century, many of the same technologies that were used to build the early internet, some of the same IBM computers, some of the same actual people who were involved in building the early internet were similarly involved with building the Visa MasterCard network. And we don't think about the Visa MasterCard network as an internet of sorts, but indeed, like when I was a kid, like as a elder millennial, when I was a kid, I can remember people not being able to swipe a card if somebody was on the phone, because it was in fact a dial-up modem system. And you can still hear even today, if you're lucky enough to have been to a bar at any point in the last year, you can hear kind of like in the back of like certain sketchy bars, like from old ATMs, you can hear like modem noises coming out of the ATMs, which kind of reveal this moment, like infrastructural inversion of there's a modem in there, and that's the only reason why this thing is working. And then of course today, their locus of interest and industrial production of consumer financial services is increasingly shifting from Wall Street to the kind of Silicon Valley social media tech industry. And increasingly payment is being kind of remade in the image of social media, as well as kind of being remade via, if we think about cryptocurrency, like remade according to internet logics from other perspectives. So yeah, I mean, it's a delight when you have this hunch that like money can be understood as a form of media, and then you keep digging and finding like ample historical anecdotes and stories that kind of support that. So a lot more in the first chapter of the book if you're interested.
I think it's really interesting because I mean, it's not like money is completely absent from media theory or communication theory, but it certainly doesn't play the kind of part that one might expect, given its significance. And you cover people like Benedict Anderson in the book on imagined communities. And this is something, certainly when I was an undergraduate student back in the day, you learn about the newspaper and nation building and things. And, and when you pose the question of like currency and notes, it's like, that's clearly like the example that is just there to be had. And when you do this historical research, a lot of the people who are writing about the histories of different currencies or different kind of money forms, it reads like media or communication theory. And some people are more explicit about it, like Mary Poovy's work, these really interesting stuff. But to me, it strikes me that if I think about people like Harold Innis or Marshall McLuhan, who obviously has writing on the on the credit card, but I'm really surprised that it's not a kind of major ongoing theme. But I want to maybe segue like more directly into the book and ask you a question. Most of the chapters in the book are titled in some way around the notion of transaction. So you kind of use it, transactional politics, transactional identities, but perhaps the kind of most overarching transactional concept is the one of a transactional community, which you define initially as the set of relations that are produced by transactional communication, but later in some more detail as having a common sense of identity, geography, and value. And it strikes me that this transactional community kind of speaks to some of your communication, community interests, but a lot of the book kind of is grounded in this as a kind of a background idea, almost as a stage for the more specific ideas to play out. Can you say a little bit, like, where did this idea like come from? Like, you know, when did you think this is a book about transactional communities? And can you maybe just flesh it out, you know, as desired for our audience?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it did actually come from, or I think, was initially inspired by some of this like Benedict Anderson type of stuff, like this kind of idea of an imagined community, like the nation state. Like, so if we have this really obvious example of a currency form producing a community in the form of national currencies, and it's you know very clearly designed to have a kind of propagandistic component, both in the way it looks, but also in the way it operates. So, you know, in the US anyway, and like for better or worse, like, you know, leaves plenty on the table for everybody else. My book is very kind of like US to global in its imagination and its empirical work. But, you know, I hope I didn't overestimate, I hope I didn't over universalize the US and rather like situated it as like my set of examples. Nevertheless, in the US anyway, and you know, again, plenty of room for other people to write stuff. Yeah, so in the US, you know, state issued currencies, you know, were being issued, but they were not fully consolidated until after the Civil War. So, you know, 1870s we're talking. And before that, any number of private currencies, locally issued currencies, company scrip, foreign currencies, bank issued currencies, you name it, kind of circulated and did the kind of job and did the work of money. And so kind of tamping down and consolidating that like monetary cacophony was kind of a post Civil War project of the state, and an attempt to kind of solidify and produce like a, you know, this kind of one nation, one currency ideal. And so it's, you know, and, you know, prior to that, like the money of rich people and the money of poor people was quite different. So poor people would frequently use, you know, low value petty coin or scrip issued by employers, whereas wealthy people tended to do exchange in letters of credit or just kind of have tabs at various merchants that kind of was settled up later, or, you know, large value banknotes. And so one thing state issued currency did, and this again, I kind of would point to Helena, is it created a situation in which all, you know, extended, I'd say the Enlightenment project of citizenship to money, and created the conditions such that even if a wealthy person had much more money than a poor person, at least they were using the same media form, the same money form. At least their money was compatible with each other, producing a kind of transactional community rooted in a shared sense of the past, a shared sense of the future, a standardization of value, a belief that the money, you know, picture long-term, like, you know, futures long-term, like community as a, you know, money as the nation as a community of shared fate, but also in the short term, like someone will take your money literally tomorrow that you've accepted. And so then, you know, and then I thought about, you know, obviously the word community gets used by Anderson and others, but then that community really emerges out of communication, out of that, you know, the transactional moment of using and exchanging and agreeing upon this money form. So it's this community that emerges via the kind of ramifications of endless transactions. So then I kind of thought, okay, so if that is kind of the mass media of money, and what we're seeing now is a disintermediation of that, a remediation of that. Are we seeing the production of new transactional communities, of niche transactional communities, of transactional communities that are somewhat more ad hoc or temporary, and that relate to each other in new ways? Yeah, please.
Because I mean, it seems it's just one thing that really interested me about the book was obviously that you're tracing on the one hand this shift from a sort of a publicly mandated public sort of infrastructures towards this situation where you have new sorts of private infrastructures, often platforms actually, or organizations with a legacy actually in communications rather than in financial kind of or in remittance. But I mean, kind of seeing this shift maybe from sort of public infrastructures to private infrastructures that ride the rails of public ones, that try and recreate them, et cetera, you're also seeing all these new forms of social stratification, like you just pointed to there, where maybe there was a historical period where there was lots of different kinds of monies. And are we seeing something similar now? And if so, like what are some of the more worrying forms of stratification maybe that we're seeing around?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I also should say that like while like mass media and social media are really useful to think with, I don't think that they are should be treated like kind of empirical law. I mean, the mass media era was filled with, in money especially, was filled with difference and distinction and silos and also meaning, like people using money in ways to express meaning other than the official kind of like state sanctioned meaning. And the social media era is in fact much more monolithic and less open to kind of counterpower than some would like to think. So I want to make sure that I don't like treat those two things as ironclad, neatly discrete eras. But setting that aside, yeah, I mean, the thing that I think is so important and one of the driving motivations for writing this book is that I think we are, if anything, like moving to an era where that like monetary cacophony is reemergent, and that we're increasingly going to have to make choices, not just about our what we buy and how we use our money, but kind of what money form to use and, see what implications those have. And I think like learning to deal with monetary plurality is like an important task for the coming decades. And I see that, the obvious example that people would go to would be something like Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies. But I absolutely see that, coming not just through kind of the coin itself, the currency itself, but also the rails that we use to access and ride, the rails that we use to access transactions. So, this is an old one, but in the United States, in order to use a card, unbanked people or underbanked people typically use like very expensive prepaid cards that have like shocking fees. So like, $5 every time you put money on the card, $20 a month, like quite expensive fees just to be able to pay. Whereas very wealthy people, or not even very wealthy people, but kind of well comported middle class people, in terms of like
middle class
financial comportment. What?
The middle class.
Yes, the middle class.
Between the
yeah, exactly. Typically are able to access credit cards that are kind of competing for their business and are able to offer them frequent flyer miles, cash back, et cetera. So we're absolutely already in a situation where some people are literally getting paid every time they pay, and some people are literally having to pay every time they pay. And of course, with anything else, it's like much more expensive to be poor. And things in the United States, EBT, which is our food benefits welfare card, has all kinds of stipulations and controls built into it. So, we have, of course, a moral panic over the money of the poor, which Zelizer kind of talked about, going back to the Victorian era. But anyway, it's very important that poor people not use their welfare benefits in ways that we would find extravagant. So you can't buy organic food with an EBT card, and you can't buy prepared food, which has the effect of this is an anecdote in the book. It has this effect that, so like a pre-cooked rotisserie chicken is usually a quite good deal in most grocery stores. It's like $7 or $10, and it's a whole chicken. It's cooked. It is good for a good number of meals. So if you're cash strapped and time strapped, it seems like it would be a good option. But because that's considered prepared food, it can't be purchased with an EBT card. But if that same chicken is not hot, but is instead chilled, if it's moved from the hot case to the cold case, then it's okay. So, and you can buy it with your EBT card. I don't know why. That's
Yeah.
just the kind, but it's a question of kind of categories.
Yes. And
And
morality, I guess, of
yes.
yeah. Because you
So
have this
those are just, and I think that it's becoming even more complex. So those are some existing, absolutely existing examples.
Because I think both Nate and I picked up on, or were interested in, you had this really interesting example in the transactional publics chapter. I think it was that chapter anyway, where you were speaking about a sex worker who's trying to be paid, and the kind of issues around that sort of payment. And I know you were kind of using that as a specific, I suppose, example of how of this kind of stratification of payments. But another thing you look at, I suppose, in the book is you're looking at like different kinds of money, special money, tokens and things like that. And I guess I'm really fascinated in how like tokens function on sites like today, like Twitch or OnlyFans or things. And it seems like, they're an example of the kind of special monies that you're describing. But maybe also, I don't know, I just wanted to know what you thought about this. It seems on the one hand, they're a way for platforms maybe to act as a payments intermediary without having a financial license sometimes, but also a way for users to maybe negotiate extra legal forms of payment. Like I remember one time we had a chat with David Birch last year where he was talking about like Chatterbait payments and how someone pointed him
Antonia Hernandez, I'll point out, has
and
done
Antonia
really great work.
Hernandez, so she's doing a talk for us on NCAD in a couple of weeks, which I think is going to be amazing. But just how like some of these sorts of questions as well. I don't know, was there a question in there? I guess I'm just really interested in how maybe some of your ideas kind of open up or read that kind of space. Yeah.
And this doesn't have to be all like questions. This is gonna be like conversational.
I've got a question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll just say to Rachel's point is that I actually was kind of remiss in not really paying attention to the streaming economy that I think really exploded actually while I was writing the book and while I was busy having a baby and all that stuff. But I would think like the world of like streaming, like Twitch and that sort of thing has one of the most sophisticated online economies.
Yeah, for sure.
And is really remarkable. And it's something I've been digging into quite a bit like now. Interesting stuff like white supremacists using Twitch to like go live at their rallies and their insurrection, the US Capitol, and then getting paid via these kind of alternative token systems, which then can be, moved into money.
I've been digging into Twitch because I think I'm really interested, I suppose, and there's some legacies in there around kind of gaming and gaming tokens as well that kind of need to be maybe picked.
And like
sorry, Nate, you had a
legacies,
question.
Yeah, like I mean EVE Online is like I think a really important precursor to the Bitcoin techno-social imaginary in many ways, the kind of radical libertarianism with this online. But Nate.
Sorry,
Thanks. Yes, well, before I ask the question, I feel compelled to give a shout out to one of my colleagues here at Warwick, Claire Rowan, also Australian in origin. She's a classicist and she's just finishing a 5-year project on tokens. And,
so
the basis
interesting.
of her project was basically there are a lot of museums around the world that have these collections of coin-like things that they just don't know, they just didn't know what they were. And one of the, and I'm probably just like massacring her research, so I apologize, Claire, but she probably won't listen anyway, is that one of the main findings was that, money that we think about as being, important historically is, really, it's not just that there's money and then these other tokens that people don't really understand. It's like, actually the tokens are at least as significant as old forms of money and account, and that there is this diverse world of token usage, and that it's actually like maybe more interesting to think about money as a form of token, is just one form of token, and that our privileging of money is a kind of result of our modern, like we have been very modern about money for a long time, and that it's anyway,
that sounds great.
Check it out.
Yeah, please make sure that I would love to see that, or
Yeah, it's a really interesting project. I kind of dipped in and out a few times of her work, and
So I wanted to ask about this case that you look at in the transactional politics chapter, which indeed follows a kind of an initial crowdfunding campaign because the person who you cover, her name is Eden Alexander, somehow gets this kind of rare and severe skin condition, and then there's a crowdfunding campaign, and then midway through the campaign is cancelled due to a kind of breach in the kind of terms of service, and what I was really interested in, because you use that as a way to kind of like deep dive into not just kind of infrastructure and the kind of the political economy of players and so on, but the really specific kind of relationships that exist between these different actors and stakeholders and so on. But for me, I was really interested because it's so loaded, right? That choice, and when you kind of begin with the discussion of WikiLeaks, which was, in some ways, it was like a global event where people realize, I guess for a certain generation at a certain point in time, where kind of payment becomes political. And, I mean, of course, for people who are working in the field, it's no surprises. But if you're interested in WikiLeaks and don't know anything about payments, that's a moment where you go, okay, this is really significant. And so I was kind of interested in how you arrived at this other case study and kind of, like what kind of work it's doing, because it's a chapter, it's a case about politics. And I kind of invite you to say something about that case.
It's my favorite kind of question. Yeah, I mean, so
I'm just throwing you the softballs.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
So I've got some real hard ones coming.
Do you?
5 minutes.
Oh,
No.
My mom's here. Be nice. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a really interesting case. So with, WikiLeaks, there was this notorious payments embargo, where suddenly it was like, major payment intermediaries, all major payment intermediaries are no longer servicing payments to WikiLeaks because of their, espionage against the United States or whatever it was. And so, and as one commentator at the time remarked, they also had, in addition to payments, they also had like their domain registry suspended, a variety of other communication infrastructures kind of suspended. And one commenter that really struck me at the time said, there was an element of theater to the concern over the blockage of their domain registration, that sort of thing. Anyone. If you don't actually need a domain to access a website, you can theoretically enter in numbers. It's like, you can move them. It's not actually, it isn't actually like that kind of proxy censorship is not that powerful, because there's always, endless redundancy in how you can kind of have your information be accessed in the internet. But he noted, this observer, that the one form of kind of proxy censorship, of kind of like control via shutting down intermediaries that would actually be powerful, was the financial one. So like there actually aren't many redundant ways to receive money in the way that there are in terms of other kinds of information. And they kind of also noted, I think, or anyway, I note that money, if we think about like money as a flow of information, in addition to being one where there isn't tremendous redundancy in the system, it's also one that is uniquely powerful because it is the resource needed to survive, for any organization, or indeed any human, to perpetuate themselves. Money at this point is somewhat necessary. So, if you're actually able to financially embargo a nation state or a organization or a person, it puts tremendous strain on them in a way that that other forms of censorship, other forms of like kind of blocking the flow of information does not. And so, WikiLeaks is a really interesting example, and it's one that's like quite clearly political. But in my research, I encountered countless examples of people suddenly losing access to their money, to their accounts, to their ability to receive or send money all the time. And for reasons that seemed kind of capital P political, but also like lowercase p political, just for reasons for like the political economy of this assemblage itself. And I think that became like a really important site of thinking about like what the public interest would look like in payments, and like any public interest payment system would enable someone to use it reliably, like to be able to pay and get paid, and to feel a sense of confidence, like that they weren't on shaky ground. And so one place where we see tremendous payment instability relates to sex work and people who are sex workers. So, you know, sex work and pornography specifically are kind of disallowed by most platform payment systems. And the reason, and it's kind of very easy to make assumptions about about purity and about like, oh, we feel that pornography is bad and therefore we don't want it on our payments intermediary. Like that's probably true to some extent, but there's like a deeper truth there if we kind of unpack the infrastructure, which I do in the chapter, which is that in the payments industry, there is a series of middlemen, and if you're a merchant, you want to get paid, you have to go through what's called an ICO, or rather, an ICO, ISO. Wait, what's my bug? I've written about this thing so intensely for like 5 years. I can't remember the basic name. ISO, Independent Sales Organization is actually what it stands for. And what these people do is that these businesses do is that they resell, yes, agree with Moto, sex work is real work and sex workers deserve payment. Indeed. So every merchant has to the payment system was designed in kind of mid-century, the Visa MasterCard kind of payment system in mid-century America that like imagined a very dyadic economy where there were like people who were consumers and there were businesses that were merchants. And it didn't kind of imagine this kind of person-to-person entanglement or like ad hoc kind of sole proprietor world that we live in today. And so in order to receive money through the Visa MasterCard network, you had to be a business and incorporated as such. And you would contract with a service provider called an ISO that provided payment services to merchants. And they are able to kind of basically charge whatever they want for those services. And typically they charge more based on industry standards around the expectation of chargeback risk. And what that means is risk of the person who made the product, who swiped the card, saying they want their money back, and the merchant and the ISO being able to recoup that money from the merchant and essentially via the network give it back to the consumer. So if you're kind of a scammy company, let's say, and you sell a bunch of scammy services, and then everybody wants their money back. If I sell a bunch of like diet pills and they don't work and everyone says this diet pill doesn't work, it's just a bag of rocks, I want my money back, but I'm truly scammy and I've disappeared overnight and my ISO can't find me, then the ISO is left holding the bag and has to pay back all of the customers that I have left unsatisfied. So because of that, if you're considered high risk, you pay more for payment services. So there's a market, and any merchant who is able to pay is typically able to receive payment services. And whether or not this is true, pornography specifically has kind of become slated as a high risk category that demands more money for payments. And some reasons, I haven't actually seen data that substantiates this claim, but the idea is that for pornography, there's a lot of times where customers will claim what is called the industry friendly fraud, where they basically say it wasn't me that made this charge. They claim to their employer, their parent, their spouse, like it wasn't me, I want my money back. I have no idea how this charge wound up on my account. Right. And also it is true, especially in the early 90s era, many online pornography sites had somewhat scammy business models where, for example, you might think you're buying access once, but in fact you've signed up for a subscription for the rest of your life, and they make it very difficult to cancel that subscription, which notably I'm pretty sure like the Trump campaign just did, and like paying for his legal fees, where people were signed up forever and had no way to figure out how to cancel their payments.
The original dark design patterns are about porn subscriptions. And
Yeah.
cancellation. It's like, what? I have to send a letter in the mail to this address and it has to have a wax stamp on it? Like, okay.
Right, exactly. By thumbprint and blood. Yeah, no, but in fact, they were, early porn websites and remain somewhat sketchy. So there's this idea that if you're going to sell porn, you have to pay more to get paid. So what used to be kind of this market formation based on an assemblage of risks and risk imaginaries has been embraced by platform payments. So the other thing is platform payments, social media companies don't like to do things with any kind of differentiality. It's one size fits all. The goal is scale. The goal is to get everybody on board. There isn't this idea that there aren't special cases for the most part in platforms. So if you are a payments company that serves, say, a crowdfunding site, you have a one size fits all approach, and your goal is to just fully disallow any form of high risk payments. So rather than charging more for them, they're just fully disallowed. And then many social media payment companies claim that they're able to get the low rates they need to get to scale, and claim that they're able to eliminate risk by instituting, surveillance, algorithmically enforced fraud protection. So basically, we're going to scan the social media of everybody involved in the transaction for anything that seems to relate to porn or other high-risk transactions. And if they're found to violate that terms of service and therefore potentially undermine our ability to get cheap rates because we're only providing low-risk service, we'll just shut down their account. So in the case of Eden Alexander, her job was to be a cam girl, an adult entertainer. She had this horrible reaction to a common drug, like over-the-counter drug, and then got MRSA and was in a totally, terrible state medically. She or some of her friends, the story kind of changes, started this crowdfunding campaign to pay for her medical expenses. Because yes, in the United States, that's how we pay for medical expenses. And then she retweeted a friend of hers who also is in the entertainment industry, who said, "I will give a free pic set," meaning free pornography, "to anyone who donates $100 to this campaign." She retweeted that offer. It was caught in the kind of surveillance dragnet. And then suddenly the account was closed and all donations that had been given to her were refunded. And so because she was relatively famous, like internet famous, and because this caught the wave of Twitter outrage for the week, and there was enough attention such that the company kind of had to apologize or make the offer that they would restart her campaign, although they couldn't take back the money that had already been donated. And another crowdfunding company tried to kind of step up and make their own name by offering her to run her campaign. But if you don't have an army of internet followers, or you aren't able to kind of harness this kind of collective outrage, you're kind of out of luck. And I document countless examples of that, where people fall afoul of algorithmic systems for a variety of reasons, not simply related to risk and pornography, but things like if you suddenly have a giant influx of money, payments going your way, if you suddenly dozens of people are giving you money and you have $10,000, your account goes from 0 to 10,000, which looks like fraud, but also looks like someone starting a business, then it's very easy. And this is for Square, which isn't, this case was Square, which is more a business service than a person-to-person service. There's countless examples. Like, I had a student who was the social chair of the Turkish student organization and was using his Venmo to receive payments to plan their annual party for the year. And he suddenly got a giant influx of payments, and people made jokes about Turkey, about Turkish politics, put Turkish flags on the Venmo captions, and his account was frozen. And they're like, the Office of basically Foreign Asset Controls and anti-terrorism, anti-money laundering needs you to explain what all of these accounts are. And he accounted for them, but his account was not unfrozen in time for them to have their party. So essentially, that it was that instability you know, creates massive problems, both kind of mundane and not so mundane.
At this point, we've got 5 minutes to go.
Oh,
No, I'm like, yeah. We were just,
but it's okay, because I'm like not actually keeping time, so I'm not flashing a 5-minute warning. But in the interest of people who are with us, feel free to bail in 5 minutes. But we'll try to kind of get towards the end. A number of questions have been kind of piling up. But to return to this case, I think, you know, what I think is so interesting is, you know, the WikiLeaks example, it's kind of spectacle, right? It's on the global stage. It's caught up in this moment. And I think what that case does is, you know, it really shows the everyday, right? It shows this kind of, even though, you know, the kind of the life of the sex worker is something that at least the platform providers want to be kind of divorced from the everyday. You know, we all know what happened. You know, there were early theories when the Pirate Bay was shut down, and you know, people were speculating that like 30% of internet traffic in Europe was just pornography. So like we kind of know that it's but anyway, but this is kind of it's an everyday case, but it's also interesting in how sinister it is, right? The monitoring of social media practices, you know, you can see the kind of everyday discriminations of like AI going on, you know, reading feeds, and then also the kind of banalities of a kind of a vague terms of service, or you know, terms and conditions, you know, breach that is unclear, and so it has this kind of everyday relatability to it that I thought, you know, was really interesting. And I kind of, anyway, I was glad that you said some more about this. I've got like 2 questions that I want to ask, but should we kind of, how do you want to do this? Do you want to turn to the other questions? I've definitely got one that I want to ask. You know, I mean,
I'm like doing the same. I think I was just going there. I'm like, I'm picking my ones I really want to ask.
I've got, you know, I want to ask about the loyalty chapter, but I'm going to leave that, and I'm going to go straight to, because, you know, this is in some ways, you know, you don't make a really strong case for it in the book, but, you know, one gets the feeling that there are the kind of deep sympathies for cash and for kind of state issued kind of money forms. And although, you know, recognizing that there are these kind of inherent kind of violences at work and hierarchies and so on, you know, one gets the impression that kind of the future is not something to be kind of excited about necessarily, at least in the ways that one sees so often, and that actually a kind of moment of reflective kind of appreciation for kind of what the state was able to do. I mean, it's in stark contrast to a lot of the alternative visions, and certainly to a blockchain scenario. But I kind of get this feeling that that, you know, cash is there. And you know, I'm reminded of this comment that Brett Scott has made about, you know, we should think about cash, you know, as the bicycle is to the car, which is like, you know, actually something that is super useful, and we should look upon as something we can use more. But
he probably said that like at a money lab in Amsterdam, where is like a bicycle driven city still, and that's not a problem of like lack of progress.
I feel 20% responsible for his claims about the bicycle and cash, just because we got him to Amsterdam at one point. Anyway, and who knows when he arrived at that insight. But at the end of the book, you turn to this. I mean, you kind of you consider a number of these kind of sci-fi novelists like Neil Stephenson, you know, like the usual suspects. But this one point where you talk about China Miéville, whose name I'm sure I'm massacring, and he was at Warwick, it may be still at Warwick, so that's even worse. But his great book on the city and the city. And you use this, and this is a book about effectively kind of two kind of inhabitants, separate communities, if you will, residing in the same city, but completely invisible to each other and kind of and separated through many ways. And one way is through the monetary form, through their currency. And you kind of use this as a way to kind of suggest kind of where we're not where we're going, but actually already where we are, because then you flesh out these examples of American students on holiday in Spain or wherever, and kind of never touching down with the local currencies. And I have similar experiences with my own students and WeChat Pay, and there are these, you can see this going about. But I want to get your thoughts on, like, where, because of course, Hayek also was a big proponent of private currencies, and there are these, no offense, Hayek, but how do you see this, this going? Because I feel like after reading your book, I want to just go and get some cash out and just put it in my wallet, like as a kind of political statement. It's
yeah, I mean,
pretty
cash
lame
is,
to say, but
I mean, it used to be cool to use cash in like the 90s, I'm told.
Yeah.
It feels vulgar now, doesn't it? With COVID, people almost feel offended,
yeah.
don't they?
Yeah, I actually did a presentation at SCMS, the Media Studies Conference, about contagion and dirt and cash and kind of dirty money, and like the social media's imagination of this seamless, frictionless interaction that doesn't involve like dirty cash that they've been kind of pitching for a while, and now it takes on new poignancy in the kind of COVID era.
Lots of Freudian references that you can take on money and
absolutely,
and feces
yeah.
and things. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, I could, but I think I've been kind of I've swam against the current in some cases in the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency scholarly community, in the sense that I've always been a voice that's like, but sometimes when we call something like government, it sounds bad, but when we call something public, it sounds good. And in the United States, we have such a withered public infrastructure on all levels. I mean, in Europe, I know there's like public media investment. There's just so much more of like a grant ecosystem. And in the United States, that's, where we've kind of gone all the way towards like neoliberalism around so much of our public investment. And even on the level of infrastructure of roads, like I think, I mean, our roads and such are not doing too good, let alone, public Wi-Fi and that sort of thing, public broadband, or rural broadband for that matter. And so I think that when we're kind of circulating in the more, anarchist circles, activist circles in blockchain scholarship, which I'm very sympathetic to, I've felt the need to kind of be this like alternative voice that's like, yes, but if we leave behind these kinds of public infrastructures, are we just opening the door to further stratification? And instead of embracing this like wonderful, anarcho-syndicalist, mutualist infrastructure, are we just going to see like layers and layers of privatization that produce distinction and difference? And I think I don't know, I feel like the kind of blockchain pessimism has kind of come back around to some extent. But I really want to keep the door open to really think about how we might produce alternatives, but also be really, really aware that as we like evacuate the institutions that have formed public life, that we are also very cognizant of what kind of fills the vacuum.
I've always been a blockchain pessimist.
Have you?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a tough position to to hold, but I mean, any of the, when there's a technical solution to something that's as if you've solved politics, like it's a bit of a moment that.
Yeah, I found myself in the strange position of being like advocating on behalf of like the state, and.
Can I ask though, Lana, why do you think, like we've seen this sudden resurgence of interest in blockchain, in crypto, in, oh my God, in NFTs, you know, in meme, you know, GameStop, meme activism, all these things that have sort of happened during the pandemic. Why? I'm just curious, why do you guys think there has been this kind of upsurge all of a sudden? Is it sort of similar to, is it coming from sort of similar anxieties that maybe fueled the rise of Bitcoin right after the financial crash? Is it economic anxiety or insecurity? Where do you think it's coming from?
Just like full post-modernity through the looking glass, like meme meaninglessness. Yeah.
Or is it that we're all online the whole time? Maybe that's it. We're so plugged into our computers that it's like, it's becoming really, Anyway.
I think it's all of that, probably.
Okay.
I mean, I think, yeah. I mean, so I talk to my students and they all say things like, I was pretty into Bitcoin when I was in middle school, but now blah, 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 blah. So I hesitate to make generational arguments, but I do think that if you're part of a generation for whom Bitcoin has always existed, for whom social media has always existed, for whom the financial crisis has always been a background and may have shaped your childhood in meaningful ways, where like the Trump administration has like been normal politics and therefore things are sort of like through the looking glass, as I said, sort of institutionally and politically, it's easy to kind of imagine that people would want, you know, there's this thing of like doomers and bloomers and like choose to bloom in the absurdity. And I think there's like a meme discourse around that, but I think there's also just the lived experience of that.
Fascinating. That's very.
But I do think one thing I'll note about like COVID crypto is that it promises a lot less than like I wrote this paper where I cite you and Pablo about the ICO boom, ICO bubble of 2017, and those made big promises about what the infrastructures that they funded were going to do. And NFTs like don't really.
I mean, they were all promises.
Yeah.
I mean, that was their main deal.
But nowadays, I mean, current crypto it makes fewer promises. Like meme coins aren't really making promises. NFTs promises, like paying creators, revitalizing intellectual property on the internet, their promises are kind of shallow, like weak. They're like, maybe, but we're not real. At the end of the day, we all know that this is just about like a different kind of financialization of an already financialized industry, which is our world.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of aesthetics going on that feels really important to that stuff. It's something I've never really worked out, but even, I don't know how many years back it was now, but I'm always struck with this example that I've been meaning to write about, where, you know, this famous potato salad crowdfunding campaign. And I've just like, ever since I watched that and the kind of performance at the time of the kind of startup, but just like the absurdity that was kind of built in, and, you know, there was the kind of wink in there. And I kind of feel like there is that in all of these areas now, like they've all got their aesthetics, and then, you know, they're sprinkled with some nihilism and just some excitement and some speculation for good measure, and you know, and then you're off. But I mean, I have no idea what to make of it.
There's something, I mean, I've been trying to articulate this and I don't think I'm there yet, but I do think, and we kind of see it with like right-wing politics around Trump and that sort of thing, where everything is this way of occupying like a meme aesthetics that's so nihilistic, so absurdist, and yet in that context, like authorizes the ability to feel something and like feel some kind of collective effervescence. And like that space for collective effervescence is carved out by the nihilism and by the absurdity. Because if you were trying to have collective effervescence without absurdity or acknowledging absurdity and without acknowledging the nihilism, then you just wind up looking like Pete Buttigieg doing the like meme dance and looking ridiculous. So I think we have to take it seriously.
And on that note,
we'll see what happens.
You have a really interesting, maybe we can put a link in the chat or something. You have a really nice article, I suppose, that you wrote recently on money. Money as a way of betting on the future, which I think kind of touches on some of the things you were just speaking about there. Have we had time to ask Lana about her new book project? Because I'm very, very interested in it, but I'm looking at Nate for permission. I can't tell if you're nodding,
so
nodding like we're out of time, or nodding
in
like
10 minutes. Okay. We're going to hear all about your new project in 50 words or less. And then while you're doing that, Rachel and I are going to very diligently look over the questions and pull out what we think are the ones that need to be posed. And then you will.
Yeah. And I should say, if anyone, I understand, Zoom, we're all in Zoom hell. And
It's only
if you
Friday
need to do your
evening
work,
in Europe.
go have a great day on Friday. Have a drink. Thank you for coming. But if you're still here and you want to stick around,
the pubs are open in England, so it's amazing that anybody's here. It's
I know, yeah,
yeah,
that's true.
They're still closed here, so.
Well, feel free to, crack open a can or a glass of wine if you're still with us and you're not on Eastern time, which I guess it's afternoon now, so do whatever. It's Friday. Yeah. Anyway, so I'm writing a book about scams. Oh, 9 a.m. Well, you can drink too if you want. All bets are off. So my new project is about scams. And I am trying to and it relates to all these things we've been talking about in the most recent conversation, which is, again and again. So first off, when I started first getting interested in scams, I began to think about how scams do this kind of boundary work to say, this is authorized capitalism and authorized exploitation, and this over here is a scam. That's bad. That's unauthorized exploitation and unauthorized capitalism. And there's this like legitimation work that happens when you call something a scam. So on the one hand, you can kind of say everything is a scam, and people are saying that. People are saying Wall Street's a scam, the 9-to-5 job is a scam, the future is a scam, retirement is a scam. All these things are scams, and they sort of are. But that assertion, while true, is almost always a kind of invitation to jump ship over into something that is in fact much more scamful. So abandon the 9-to-5 for my pyramid scheme, abandon college for this like extremely exploitative for-profit college, or programming boot camp, or yoga teacher training program, where you just learn how to train other yoga teachers. And so I'm interested in how like this like crisis of institutions and crisis of faith in institutions is both like surfacing this idea that yes, indeed, there are these scams and this is just boundary work, but then it's sort of like, so what? Where does that leave us now? And how do we, I guess, learn to live with the plurality of like vantage points on what's a scam and what isn't a scam? And then the other kind of thing I'm thinking about with scams right now is that so often in the popular imagination and in the literature, scams are imagined as dyadic. So there's a scammer and a mark, or, con artist and a victim. But what I'm seeing, and I think I came to this mostly through my journeys in crypto, is that the scams we're seeing today, whether it's crypto or MLMs or whatever, aren't in fact these dyadic things where there's one con artist. Like, who's the one con artist in an MLM? Rather, it's this network of believers and non-believers. And so I argue that like a scam is an attempt to bring about a shared future, or a story we tell about bringing about a shared future. And then that the belief in that future is unevenly spread among the participants in this network. And benefit is also like likelihood of benefiting from this project is unevenly spread among participants. And then it's unknowable really, like who believes and who doesn't. So, in this ICO paper that I'm writing right now, it's like a true believer is indistinguishable from a shill. And everyone wants to hodl, but nobody wants to be a bag holder. So, and you don't, it's like, and everyone's sort of oscillating, to use a Bill Maher term, he talks about oscillation in terms of alternative economies, in terms of like oscillating between the economy as is and the economy that could be, like oscillating between like scammer and scammy and belief and non-belief. And I think part of that is like this meme nihilism thing that we're talking about. So yeah, that's my new book.
I can't wait. I really like the whole premise of it. I think it's so interesting. So Nate, do we have time to maybe take one or two questions then that are coming in the chat? Because I saw a while ago, actually, because we've kind of been chatting about so many different things. Jaya Clara Breck has asked some quite interesting questions, I guess, about sort of power and how power operates. And I'm going to actually maybe read out her question and editorialize tiny bit as well, because I think we had some questions that kind of relate to this too. So she says, if money as media played such a big part in nation building, to what extent can new monies be understood as reflecting in any immediate way new forms of actual power? For example, the extent to which Libra DM first considered a threat by central banks or others, or whether new monies are more like a thin layer of new intermediation in the form of apps. So I guess this is our question of, are they riding the rails of public things? Are they emerging as new public actors? And I was quite interested in, I think in the chapter where you're talking about Libra, that you had this idea of Libra as being kind of Silicon Valley feudalism. So it's not only maybe that we're seeing platforms emerging as new kinds of state actors, but maybe also alongside the platform, are we seeing kind of a new sort of almost pre-capitalist operation of power? Maybe there's too many questions in there. I want to ask all the questions. But yeah, I don't know, make of all those what you will.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, I think one of the babies with throwing out the baby with the bathwater of liberal democracy is some mechanism, albeit horrendously imperfect and maybe not that much of a baby to be thrown out, is some form of democracy, some form of redress. And we really don't see that in platforms. What is the mechanism for public redress in something like a platform like Facebook? And what is, we'll see if something like Facebook remains sort of unregulatable in the global context. So yeah, and I think I do think that part of all of these new monies are an attempt to kind of produce new transactional communities, each with their own kinds of politics, that are intersecting and relating to existing platforms and existing transactional communities. Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about a lot of this. I'm not sure if I answered it, but there's so much to say.
No, I think yes, but no, I think that's pretty succinct. Yeah, Nate, was there anything?
All right, yes. So I have a question from Chris, who begins with the preamble, but then arrives at a question which I'll just deliver straight. And I think this question is interesting because in your book, I wouldn't call it like a hardcore infrastructure study. And it's not like a work of software studies or hardware studies where you spend a lot of time on the protocols, and but you certainly map out a kind of infrastructure of actors, and a lot of the discussion is kind of mapping out what you could call the kind of institutional / infrastructural backend of payments. So this question is, in your view, how important is the design of money, especially on the front end, how it looks, feels, communicates, etc.? And are there areas / examples where the design of monetary interactions particularly shapes its use or meaning? And this is from a person who's working in human-computer interaction and kind of dealing with these questions, which are somewhat close to me. So I'd like to hear your thoughts.
I think that's a really interesting question. This is kind of like a oblique answer, but one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is, potentially in the United States with the new political administration, we may have some political will around thinking about public interest payments, postal banking, maybe, I'm not sold on this, but something like a central bank issued digital currency. I know some blockchain advocates see a central bank issued digital currency as having, because it's a token-based system, as having some ability to preserve privacy, some ability to not curtail flow and direction of payments. I mean, when you look at that in the case of actually existing or nascently existing central bank digital currencies, such as in China, then we read it the other way and see, as just a vector of surveillance. So, remains to be seen, but nevertheless, there's a beginning public debate in the US about the possibility of having some kind of electronic payments that are public in the, explicitly public interest. And what the rails look like, what the interface looks like, even if we say we want this, that's there's a totally huge range of questions about what it is. And I think, in the US anyway, if you look at state like government websites, they're really bad. So, the Affordable Care Act was largely flummoxed by the like terrible websites that were the kind of the exchanges to get healthcare. The PPP, which was the payroll protection program, paycheck protection program for small businesses in COVID, that was like, it had to be rolled out like basically in a weekend, but it was very much a disaster. So I do wonder about what the kind of platform stack would look like for a public payment system. And like, we need to and I think like having conversation around that is really interesting. And like, what role could the private sector have in producing those infrastructures? So my husband, Kevin Driscoll, and his colleague, Julian Mayland, wrote a book about the French Minitel system. And one of the things I think is really interesting is that Minitel had this interesting balance between public and private, where it was like kind of state centralized, but no more state centralized than the infrastructure that copied it, which is the Apple and the Apple iTunes store, and then sort of had these like ability to have public or rather private or nonprofit apps that kind of they didn't call them apps, but programs that rode the rails of the Minitel. So I think that it would be very interesting for a kind of public interest payment system that does have like public subsidy to have the ability to have some level of private sector, including nonprofit, including, a variety of other kinds of collectives, build systems that kind of ride those rails, and think about it more as like supporting an ecology rather than like maybe providing an app, because whatever app they provide is probably going to suck. So that's what I've been thinking about. And I would love it if HCI people, who have that expertise were interested in that sort of thing.
I'm really interested in like physical cash in those terms as well. Like, so obviously Lana's book is, how money became social media, but I think it's really interesting to think about cash as being almost like a proto-social media. Particularly, examples where people they're actually utilizing the physical kind of hand-to-hand sort of circulation of the banknote as a way to sort of like tell a story. Like, even you use this idea that money is the skin of the state, and so we always see, as you say, there's these very top-down visions of what the state should be being communicated in money. And I love examples then where people sort of communicate like a critique of that by circulating money. Like in Ireland, we have a system called direct provision, which is too hard to explain, but very kind of troubling, I suppose, asylum kind of process that involves this thing called direct provision. And so people have written on the EU notes, end borders, or end direct provision, no borders, these sorts of messages. Or now, can I share my screen? There's a really nice art piece from the 1970s, similarly, where the artist, it's called Insertion into Ideological Circuits. He writes these sorts of anti-imperialist messages on Brazilian banknotes, spends them back into circulation, just as a tie-in, I guess, when Lana's speaking about money as media. I always thought, that's, to me, that's like a proto-social media kind of idea.
Yeah, in the talk I gave about COVID and money and dirt, it's like I kind of argued that money is like a public media, cash is a public media, both in the sense that it's like publicly provisioned, but also that it's like lives in public and we hold it for just a little while, and like to the public it returns. And there's this anxiety of being in public and being together, and then this kind of privatization of the public sphere through apps and that sort of thing that provides some kind of like enclosure from the kind of like walled garden, from the kind of morass of being in public. Anyway, I'm sympathetic that we've gone on for quite a long time.
Yeah, I think it's time to draw
only
this to
half
a
an hour
close.
over.
Yeah, I should just say that all of these sessions that I do go for an hour and a half, just to set expectations. So
for sure.
Anyway, so I would very much like to thank Lana and Rachel for joining me on what has been a fascinating and rich discussion, and thanks to our participants for their interesting questions and lively observations in the chat, only some of which could make it onto the main stage. So thanks everyone for coming. And I hope to see some of you at future events. Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much.